Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of, finally, the Canon EOS R5, a camera that in many ways I think has probably been at least my most highly anticipated Canon camera, probably since the EOS 5D Mark IV, a camera that I highly anticipated as one that, took some steps forward in terms of sensor performance and, focus performance, and it kind of launched Canon, at least on the DLR stage, into better contention with, some rival models from Nikon, for example. And finally, we're getting to the place where Canon has done just that in the mirrorless space. Canon's introduction with the EOS R has proved to be really polarizing in that there were some things that Canon did really well and then some other areas where Canon had these just huge missteps that left a lot of people, wondering if they were going to be able to catch up when Sony had such a huge lead on them with, their third generation of cameras at that point. But fortunately, Canon has really been working on the innovation front. And in many ways, the announcement of the EOS R5 was kind of more of a Sony type announcement in the sense that it was just loaded with technical innovation and specs that when they were, leaked, as they so often are, a lot of us wondered whether or not that would actually be the reality of what would arrive to us, because it just seemed very un-Canon in all of the various technological advances, from the high resolution sensor to the very fast, burst rate to what seemed like really amazing video specs and compatibility there. And so it was somewhat of a shock that Canon actually delivered all of those things to us. And for that I am certainly very thankful. And as I noted, I personally have really anticipated the arrival of the EOS R5. And of course, as always, when you have something that has a lot of hype associated with it, my job as a tester, a reviewer, is to kind of parse out the reality from the marketing hype. And I hope to be able to do that for you here today in this definitive review. And so if you're not familiar with my definitive review format, it's a long format in that I go through things and a lot of details. I show you a lot of supporting evidence as a part of it. And by the time I get to my conclusion, you'll probably be hopefully on the same page with me as to why I came to that conclusion. Now, if you want a faster review with less details, then I would recommend that you check out the standard review instead, and that will be probably more up your speed. Today's episode is brought to you by Ridge, the wallet redefined. It's time to ditch that bulky old wallet full of stuff you don't need and move to a sleek aluminum, titanium, or carbon fiber Ridge wallet. It takes up a little more room than a credit card, has RFID blocking technology to protect your information, and comes with a lifetime warranty. Visit ridge.com/Dustin and use code Dustin to get 10% off your order, along with free shipping worldwide. So in today's definitive review, we're going to start off by taking a look at build and handling, the things that have changed from the EOS R to the R5, and then also some of the major new designs and specifications, and to see the advances that Canon has made here in the physical design and features of this camera. Let's take a look. So let's take a little bit of a look at the EOS R5 and how it compares to, for example, the original EOS R, along with some other features that we're going to discuss as a part of this. So as you can see, I've got a small rig grip extender on the EOS R. They do make something like that for the EOS R5 that I've got on one of the copies here. I mostly like to have this for making it ARC compatible. And so anyway, that's on one of these. Obviously the other I've got bare here. Now the R5 kind of bridges the two main Sony lines in that it has some of the features of the A9 series, but also the resolution and general purpose capabilities of the A7R series. And so it's a little bit hard to direct compare them, but I'm going to compare it to the A9 Mark II because there are a variety of interesting similarities there. And so obviously in terms of the build here, this is the largest of the three cameras here. I will also say it is the nicest in hand, at least if you may have larger hands like myself, though you do note a little bit more weight if you've been shooting primarily with smaller mirrorless bodies. But in terms of just having a natural grip that you can put in your hand and feel like you're holding a real camera, so to speak, the R5 is great in that regard. And so it weighs in at 735 grams. That's with batteries, or battery and memory cards, compared to 660 grams for the R5 and 678 grams for the A9 Mark II. It is 138 millimeters in width compared to 135.8 on the R and 128.9 for the A9 Mark II. Height is surprisingly just a little bit lower than what the R is. So it's 97.5 millimeters compared to 98.3 millimeters, and the A9 Mark II is the smallest at 96.4 millimeters. Then finally, depth, which is going to be here at that great grip, is 88 millimeters compared to 84.4 millimeters compared to 77.5 millimeters for the A9 Mark II. I can definitely tell you that this fits my hand best of the three options. Now, Canon is fully invested in their articulating LCD screens, which I'm really thrilled about. They're great touch screens, and so everything from navigating menus to doing touch to shoot or select, they really have done a great job with those. They're also a little bit higher resolution than the Sony ones, so we've got 2.1 million dot resolution on these two compared to 1.44 million dot resolution on the screen on the Sony, which of course is just a tilting, not a fully articulating screen. Likewise, we've got higher resolution here on the viewfinder. It's a great viewfinder, 5.76 million dot resolution, but also with the higher refresh rate that allows you to really be able to track action. If you switch into that, it does burn through battery faster, but having that 100 frame per second refresh rate really is going to help to have a smooth natural action. And so we've got 3.69 million dot resolution in the EOS R, and then in the A9 Mark II it's 3.68 million resolution. Now, another interesting thing as far as focus systems, so some of these internal specifications, is that we've got a new pinnacle of range of focus on the R5. And so we have sensitivity down to an amazing -6 EV value, but also all the way up to a +20 EV value. Whereas with the EOS R, we've got that amazing -6 EV value ability to focus, and so that's able to focus in basically dark conditions, but up to a little bit less, +18 EV. Whereas on the A9 Mark II, it's only sensitive down to -3 EV, although it does go up to the +20. So what that tells me is that the R5 should be a much more capable camera in low light conditions than what the A9 Mark II is. Now, another area of interest is when it comes to the shutter and the buffer depth. And so, again, this camera is kind of straddling the A7R and the A9 series. And so resolution-wise, this is higher resolution than the A7R Mark III, obviously, though not up to the even higher resolution of the R4. But what we've got is 45 megapixels, lots of information that has to flow through the pipeline. And yet, impressively, Canon has allowed for, with the electronic shutter, 12 frames per second. And at 12 frames per second, you're getting a buffer of 180 full resolution RAW files or 350 JPEGs, which is a very, very useful amount of buffer there. Not quite as good as what the A9 Mark II has. It has 239 raw frames or 361 JPEGs, but both of those are within the conversation, though the A9 Mark II only gives you 10 frames per second with mechanical shutter. Now, if you move to electronic shutter, you bump up to 20 frames per second, but in the case of the R5, the buffer depth actually shrinks considerably. Instead of 180 raw files, it's only rated at 83 raw files with the electronic shutter, or 170 JPEGs. So with JPEGs, that's useful enough, but with raw files, that's only giving you a little over 4 seconds to capture your action. That may be enough in some situations, but maybe not all. But on the A9 A9 Mark II, you retain that 239 RAW files or 361 JPEG files, even at 20 frames per second, which obviously is incredibly useful. Now, the EOS R, of course, was a joke in this regard. It gave you 8 frames per second, but without full-time tracking. If you went to the full-time tracking mode, you dropped to something like 3 frames per second, and so just not at all useful for tracking action. Now, in terms of the shutter speed, you're allowed up to just the 1/8,000th. And so that's true whether you're using the mechanical or, surprisingly, the electronic shutter. And whereas on the A9 Mark II, you get 1/8,000th of a second for the mechanical. But if you go to the electronic shutter, you actually have a headroom of 1/32,000th of shutter speed. And so obviously that can be useful with, with wide aperture glass in certain situations. So finally, let's talk about, in terms of specifications, about video specs. Obviously, the Canon has kind of thrown everything into the R5. And so there are some issues with overheating that have been documented. However, for most of us that are not maybe using the extremes as often, so far I haven't had any overheating issues with the kind of video that I do. I'm typically just shooting 4K 30 for my purposes, with some occasional higher, resolution 4K stuff or higher frame rate 4K stuff. But I'm tending when I'm doing that to be shooting more short bursts, and so I haven't had any overheating problems. That being said, you've got amazing specifications here. 8K at 30 frames per second. In 4K mode, you can go all the way up to 120 frames per second. You've got picture profiles and you've got C-Log and all of those things, which is very impressive. This is an area where the A9 Mark II, while I actually love the A9 bodies for filming, I'm actually filming this segment on the A9 right now, but you're limited to 4K 30 there with no picture profiles, no S-Log, and so definitely the R5 wins that battle when it comes to just talking about your basic resolution. So let's take a quick look here at some of the things that are new and improved here in terms of the body. And so one of the things that stands out is you do have an additional button here that can be programmed to various functions. I'm actually got it programmed right now to give me quick access to switching into APS-C mode. And so in some situations where I want some additional reach for wildlife and I want to shoot, with it automatically cropped in, I can quickly access that in that mode. What we have also got added here is a remote release port that has been added into the mix here. Now, if we move to the taking a quick look at the top line here is fairly similar. In both cases, we have got similar placement of buttons. We've got the same top LCD screen. So everything pretty similar there. However, there are some important and valuable ergonomic tweaks here to the back of the camera. And so, a lot of us complained about the touch bar. Canon took that to mind. It ditched the touch bar, and we have a much more useful joystick here instead, which I'm really thrilled about. And also, I would say just a slightly better, logical button placement here up in this area. And so I think positive moves there. Also very positive is that here we just had a D-pad on the EOS R. We now have a kind of traditional 5 series or 1 series dial here in the back, which I find very useful. It just gives you one additional dial control point, and so I find that very useful. And so, byproduct of that is just the physical controls end up being just a little bit better as a result of that. Now, in terms of opening up ports here on the side, everything is not all that different, but just a little bit more precise. We now have, our USB-C and HDMI out there. And once again, this still requires power send coming to, if you're going to charge in camera, so not as flexible as Sony or Fuji or things like that. Second flap here has microphone and then headphone monitoring, and then finally we have a flash sync port that is here at the bottom. And so everything pretty similar there. Now, it used to be on the EOS R, we had a single, SD card slot here on the side. So with the EOS R5, we have a more serious door here. We have got CF Express for one slot, and so, that gives you some serious speed updates. Our second card is SD, but it's UHS 2 compatible, so giving us a little bit of extra speed. We do have a minor tweak to the battery. It's still the same profile, it's still backwards compatible, but now we have an LPE6NH. And so what it is a little bit higher in terms of the power that it holds, and so as compared to the N. And so this was rated at 1865 mAh in terms of the power capacity, and the newer battery pack is rated up over 2000 at 2130 mAh of power. And so just got a little bit more grunt there, because this is a camera that just is, requires a little bit more. Finally, bottom plate, pretty straightforward here. Good levels of weather sealing throughout this body. It feels tough, it feels robust, and obviously is very, very feature rich. So a couple of things really stand out to me. Obviously, the addition of having Canon's image stabilization is huge. And so, as you can see from this footage here, it certainly makes a significant difference to be able to go from having that image stabilization to, in camera, to not having it. And so I believe that that obviously is an area that makes a significant difference. And Canon has designed a system that in many ways gives us a little bit of a leg up on Sony, both in terms of its rating, but also in terms of the kind of seamlessness with which it works with the in-lens stabilization that a number of Canon's early lenses have. And so between those two things, working in cooperation, you can get some truly amazing numbers, up to as high as 7 or 7.5 stops of hand-holding assistance, which is obviously really, really impressive. Now, at the end of the day, I'm still convinced that you're going to get your very best, most stable footage either off of a tripod or a gimbal, and no amount of combination of in-lens and in-camera stabilization is going to quite equal that. But short of that, it is a really impressive system, and obviously a delight to have as a part of this design. The second thing that really stands out to me is that the ergonomics here, Canon I think has pretty much nailed ergonomics. I don't really have hardly anything to criticize here, and them ditching the touch bar, my biggest criticism on the EOS R, and then also giving the addition of the wheel rather than the directional pad. It just gives us now a total of 3 wheels on camera to control various aspects, and so then the control ring on the lenses just becomes kind of an additional bonus extra that you can kind of set up to, whatever best suits your purposes. This is a camera that feels really, really great in hand, and it's kind of fortunate that it does, because if there is a criticism here of the EOS, R system at this point, it is that a lot of the lenses are big. I mean, just big all around. And while there are a few cases where Canon has designed a smaller lens than what the equivalent was on DSLRs, at the same time, we've got a number of lenses that are in fact considerably larger than what their EF counterparts were. And that's obviously refers to the RF 50mm f1.2 or 85mm f1.2 lenses that are fairly huge by comparison. And even a lens like the 15 to 35mm f2.8 is large, compared to the 16 to 35 that we had on the EF. And so you kind of need a sound body ergonomically to handle what is a number of large lenses. And of course, it seems like Canon is really serious about going after long telephotos for this system, and I think that we're going to see a lot of that over the next few years. And so having a camera that is robust in hand, to me, is important. Now, I get that the argument for many people is that their idea of mirrorless was to be smaller and lighter. And if that is your idea, I don't think that Canon's approach to this point, at least as far as full frame, is going to be for you. And you might be more comfortable in the space that they've designed for APS-C mirrorless instead. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of us who prefer a camera that is more robust. I'm not so much interested in mirrorless for being smaller and lighter. I think that there are a lot of other mirrorless advantages that I'm personally interested in. And to me, Canon has nailed the ergonomics here. At the same time, I completely get if it's a little bit of a big and heavy beast for you. So let's talk about the focus system here, because Canon has taken the good aspect of the EOS R. The EOS R had a very, very competent focus system, but it was completely crippled by having extremely poor tracking capabilities, and that while you had 8 frames per second on paper, that wasn't 8 frames per second with autofocus, that was with fixed focus. And so if you needed autofocus, those rates dropped precipitously to where you're really dealing with 3 and 4 frames per second of true tracking capability. And so that focus system was great if all you wanted to do was to shoot portraits, or maybe to shoot events, but where you were not needing to shoot bursts so much as just, tracking action in varying lighting conditions and getting more of single shots or a few shots, but not a true burst of tracking action. It was not an action camera. Canon has managed to not only boost our resolution here from 30 to 45 megapixels, which is a significant 50% jump there, but they've also managed to give us a just basically unleash the capabilities of that tracking system by giving us amazing tracking capabilities and a buffer depth here as well. And we've already talked a little bit about the buffer depth of the camera, but what I found when I actually did test is that, first of all, I think that the AF system here, it really feels effortless to me in terms of tracking action in the way that the Sony A9 series does, which is an amazing amount of praise, because the A9 system is incredible, and to me it was revolutionary to be able to track action without blackout and with such ease of just all of those AF points across the frame being able to just stay locked in on. And then when you added in things like real-time AF, IAF tracking capabilities, it just took it to a whole nother level with the A9, and even more so in the A9 Mark II. And that really is just like what it feels like on the EOS R5, which is a lovely feeling. And so the 12 frames in mechanical shutter actually best the A9 series, and I found that to be a joy. Actually, that was probably my favorite experience for the simple reason that, as you can see in this sequence, number one, tracking was flawless as a part of that. And so I had PET IAF engaged, and it just did a flawless job of tracking throughout that series. Now, what is interesting is that I first started off having forgotten to account for the switch between human IAF detect and PET IAF detect. And so in the first tracking sequence, as you can see here, I was actually really disappointed. I used the RF 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 LIS for these sequences, and I expected much better results, and then it hit me about 2/3 of the way through the sequence. Maybe I didn't switch over to PET IAF. Sure enough, that was the issue, and so I switched to PET IAF, and as we saw already, the tracking was flawless. Now, if you switch over into electronic shutter, you can jump up to 20 frames per second, which obviously is even more impressive. And while the tracking was very good during that sequence, as you can see here, it's actually a longer sequence for the simple reason that you get considerably more frames per second. But what I did find is that while the tracking was good, I felt just a hair poorer than what I saw in mechanical. And that's probably mostly just due to so many more frames running through. But what I did feel is that, peak sharpness levels weren't quite as good as what I saw with mechanical shutter. And, that's actually borne out a bit by this test that was done. I believe the site is called Photons to Photos. And so in their chart testing, they actually found that you got mildly better image quality results with the mechanical shutter versus the electronic shutter. And that's what I felt like I saw in real world results. However, the difference is marginal and at a pixel level. And so to have that ability to switch over into 20 frames per second is truly impressive. And of course, if you're shooting in a mechanical shutter, to be able to get 180 RAW files before you fill the buffer, or 350 JPEGs, is really impressive. Again, it's a little bit more constricting with the electronic shutter, 83 RAW files and 170 JPEGs. If you're shooting JPEG sequences, as I did here, I think there's nearly 160 images in that sequence, but it wasn't a problem. And one thing I did note compared to Sony's is that I really didn't notice any writing after I shot even these very long bursts, that the camera essentially seemed to be pretty much ready to go again, and no restrictions as to what I could do in menus. And so I found that to be really impressive in terms of that result. And so to get high resolution and high burst rates like that, very impressive. Also very impressive was the IAF results. The, if you're shooting in a portrait or an event situation, the eye detected just right on. And then as you move around or the subject moves around, it just follows and stays locked on. And the end results were consistent and well focused. And so very impressed with how far Canon has come with that, considering where they started on the EOS R, before the firmware updates. Final area that's really impressive when it comes to the EOS R5, and probably the most impressive of any camera that I've used to this point, is that you have the ability to focus in EV range of -6, which is extremely dark conditions. I mean, that is dark enough to where you're not really seeing your subject hardly at all. And then all the way up to +20, which is extremely, extremely bright conditions. And so to have that kind of range, 26 stops of exposure in which the camera can autofocus, is very impressive and definitely surpasses anything that I'm seeing from competitors right now. And of course, you're going to get that -6 result if you're using one of Canon's more sensitive lenses, f1.2 type lenses. But even if you're using an f2.8 lens, you're still getting, somewhere near -5 EV. Very, very impressive. And on top of that, Canon now has the ability for you to focus with a maximum aperture of something like -20, just a ridiculously small maximum aperture, which is what allows them to, do lenses like the new, f11 lenses that you can still use an extender on and get an even smaller maximum aperture combination and still autofocus. And so a focus system here is just superb, and it's just a genuine joy to use. I find it easy to move, focus point around with the thumb. You can do touch to focus, touch to shutter, all of those things that, and the touchscreen has wonderful sensitivity. And so all those things combine to be a truly excellent autofocus situation. Now, of course, a lot of the early focus, I'm a little bit late to the party because of how long it took for me to get EOS R. I've actually got 2 of them. I'm filming on one, and one EOS R5, and I've got another here on hand, and so I'm thankful for the way that did work out in the end, so I get to evaluate a couple of them. However, a lot of the early controversy has been on the overheating issue. It seems like it's a guarantee to me that any time that Canon has a major release, that somebody is going to find some obscure flaw and they are going to flog that until that's all that anyone talks about. And that essentially has been the case with the overheating here. Now, my first caveat is this: I've not run into the overheating issue personally yet. At the same time, I do recognize, number one, I live in Canada. It's not exactly the hottest place in the world. And number two, I very rarely am shooting at video extremes. At the moment, I am recording at 4K 30, which is the way that I record for my channel. And so, yeah, I do, kind of longer length videos, but not necessarily in challenging conditions, at least on the hot end of the spectrum. And so while Canon has amazing capabilities here, and they've pushed the envelope of what is possible in a body like this, without any kind of acting cooling situation, they've done that with what I think they assumed would be an understanding that you're going to have some practical limits to how far you can push those extremes, particularly when it comes to 8K. The camera is capable of 8K 30 recording, which is something that obviously is very, very impressive. No one else is really doing at this point. However, there's a practical limit of the heat that is generated by a sensor that's recording at that kind of resolution. And so most people have found that there is a limit to how long they can record before the camera hits a heat limit. Already there have been firmware updates that have tried to mitigate that somewhat and to help with it, but I think we understand at this point this is going to be a point of vulnerability, and there's going to be a limit to a body this size that is packed with this much electronics without any kind of external venting that is, about how good heat dissipation is going to be able to be. And so that's certainly going to be a factor. Likewise at 4K, 120 frames per second, which is wonderful to be able to have for, slow motion and to give you flexibility for the footage you record. But that's going to be probably most useful for running gun type situations. And I think that honestly the 4K 120 is probably less of an issue because there's some people that are going to want to shoot long format in 8K 30 for the, the editing flexibility. Whereas, something like 4K 120 tends to be something that people are getting clips of, an action sequence, something that they want the flexibility to slow down, not so much something that they want to shoot a long format. So I personally think that probably the biggest issue is going to be for those who are wanting to either shoot 4K 60 or 8K 30 for longer format. And if you shoot in hotter environments, you might have an issue with that. I haven't to this point, and I'm unlikely to have it with the kind of scenarios that I personally shoot in. And so for me, there's no problem. Your mileage may vary, obviously, depending on your needs. But obviously, what the upsides here is that you have a huge amount of flexibility in the formats you can use, the resolution that you can use, and so it just, in many ways, this is, in this kind of body, it's the best camera that Canon has produced thus far for video, outside of their Cine lineup. And I think that a lot of people are going to love the video capabilities here. And of course, it's a huge relief to be able to just do what I'm doing in shooting 4K without some kind of huge crop factor. And so I'm delighted to have that flexibility here as well. Also, that great video, or great AF system becomes a great video AF system with great eye tracking and a capability to just be rock solid for, tracking action. And so a lot of great stuff there. So let's talk about the sensor. We're going to dive in and look at some of the, kind of main areas that are important here. And so we're going to start off by taking a look at ISO. And if Canon has managed to bump up resolution, but without falling into the pitfall they did with the 5DSR, where, noise started to cripple you at any kind of higher ISO setting. Let's jump in and let's take a look. The Canon 5DSR, with its 50 megapixels of resolution and no low-pass filter, I think still remains today probably the platform where, under optimal conditions, you can get the most highly detailed image out of any current Canon sensor. But it had some severe liabilities that came with that, and that's why I highlight the idea of optimal. The EOS R5 has a little bit less resolution at 45 megapixels, but as we're going to see, it has far fewer limitations and thus much more flexibility on how you can get mileage out of that sensor. So first of all, let's just kind of scroll around here, take a peek at base, which is ISO 100, and so you can see everything is clean and smooth, detail is nice here. That's our baseline that we're going to look at as we kind of climb throughout the ISO range. So first stop is ISO 200. I would not expect to see any difference here, any additional noise, and in fact I do not. At ISO 400, we see, looking at globally, things look identically. Looking in here, we have similar levels of, kind of dynamic range and contrast, and we can see everything looks nice and smooth in the shadow area. Likewise, if we move on to ISO 800, we see that everything is still completely smooth, no apparent additional noise, contrast looks good, detail is excellent, and so overall we still have a great looking result, color fidelity all the same. ISO 1600, looking at things globally, it looks no different on a global level. If we zoom into a pixel level, we see that our contrast remains excellent, detail everywhere looks great. We can see that color saturation levels look similar, and if we slide over into the shadow area, everything remains nice and smooth here. At this stage, it is hard to see really any additional noise being introduced into the shadows. Now, as we move up to ISO 3200, this is the range I think that probably most people, first start to think about really being in higher ISO range these days. And we can see that you are, for the first time, starting to see just the tiniest amount of shadow information, in terms of a noise, pattern noise there. But looking up here, contrast continues to look excellent. Inside the SLR, everything is nice and clean. Color fidelity looks excellent. Detail looks excellent. Overall, there's very, very little to complain about here. Moving on up to ISO 6400, we can see colors look nice and saturated. You can see a little bit more noise as you go into the shadow area, which is, of course, completely smooth at ISO 100. The transition is a little bit smoother. Looking inside at the mirror, you can see a little bit of pattern noise there, but contrast remains excellent. Color saturation levels look excellent. And while we see some noise here, what we're not seeing is any kind of banding or discoloration showing up in the shadow information. And so basically by this point with the 5DSR by ISO 6400, you were at the absolute limit. I mean, the noise levels were so high that really you needed to downsample to have a reasonable end result. Moving on to ISO 12800, we can see that globally everything looks good. If we zoom into a pixel level, contrast levels look fantastic still. Color saturation levels look really good. You can see, that it's kind of growing in terms of the noise that's there in those shadows, and so you are losing some smoothness in those areas for sure. In here, a little bit more noise, but I mean, nothing that's destructive. And down in this area, obviously starting to get a little bit rougher. However, I'm not seeing color banding entering in. And the shadow, while there's noise there, it's remaining pretty even. Now ISO 25600, you're starting to push on up there into serious range. And obviously on the 5DSR, you could forget it at ISO 25600. And what I see here is definitely some obvious noise in terms of getting fairly rough. Color fidelity and contrast levels continue to be pretty good, however, and we can see that color saturation here looks nice. This area of noise is growing and becoming more obvious, but at the same time, looking at the image globally, I would say it's still perfectly usable. Now the native range on the EOS R5 actually goes up a little bit higher than a lot of competing cameras, up to 51,200. I would say looking at the image globally, there is an ever so slight color shift here, a little bit less warm, a little bit more green, I would say here. However, I mean, it still looks usable at a global level. If you zoom into a pixel level, you can definitely see noise, and I think that we've lost some contrast there in the text. Even here in the grip, you can see that the shadows are being lifted because of the amount of noise. And so, there's just less contrast that remains as a byproduct of that. Very little transition out from the, the grip of the camera into what should be the blackened shadow area. And that's because those shadows have lifted really, really high. You can see a bit of a color banding in there, just a little bit of discoloration, but it's not like obvious on a destructive level, and thus on a global level, everything here is still useful. Color levels, saturation levels are still, I would say acceptable here. And so I wouldn't be my preference to shoot at 51,200 with the EOS R5, but I think in a pinch for some applications you could get away with it. So for some perspective, I actually standardized around the resolution of the EOS R with the EOS R5 and then also with the Sony A7R Mark III. And so, another high megapixel body, but standardizing around the, the long end resolution is 6,720 pixels of the EOS R. And so it just gives us a standard to compare at. So first of all, you can see at ISO 25600 that the result from the EOS R5 is really impressive looking by comparison. You can see that the EOS R5 is retaining much better contrast. Looked at a global level compared to the EOS R, it actually looks like you're shooting at a much lower ISO level, particularly after downsampling to that resolution. And so this allows us to compare straight up at a pixel level, and at a pixel level you can see it's really impressive how much better the EOS R5 looks by comparison here. And so you can see you're retaining much better contrast. Shadow lift is much more obvious on the EOS R. You can see color banding there and kind of uneven patches that you just don't see on the R5. And so overall, I'm really impressed by how much better the EOS R5 looks, if you make all things equal. Now the A7R Mark III is a bit of a higher standard to compare to, and so I do want to make first of all a couple of observations. I've actually added 1/3 stop of exposure into the R3 results. I found that it is much less sensitive than what the EOS R5 is. So if you look at the difference in shutter speed and you consider I've added another third stop here, what you're actually seeing is about 2/3 of a stop difference in terms of exposure and thus of sensor sensitivity. And so that is obviously an advantage for the EOS R5. It delivers a brighter image at equivalent, exposure values, or at least shutter values, and so impressive there. But here we've standardized again around the 6720, and so what you can see is, looking in this area here, shadow information is definitely smoother on the R5. You can definitely see there's less visible noise on the timer face. If we look inside the the SLR here, you can see much more noise on the mirror that is there. And if we look towards the shadow area, the actual shadows are just rougher in terms of just the evenness of the illumination of pixels. You can just see that there are some just kind of bright spots on the EOS R5, and looking in this area here, it's just choppier and rougher looking by comparison. And so I would say, once again, held up against what I consider to be a very good competitor, that the EOS R5 has done quite a great job of comparing even under this circumstance. And so, particularly impressive to me is the end result there when you're downsampling and kind of equaling out to the EOS R resolution. And even at that 30 megapixels, you can see just how impressive a job that Canon has done here. And, I found the practical limit to, basically the absolute extreme on the 5DSR to be ISO 6400. And even then, I felt like I needed to downsample to get usable results. That's clearly not the case here. And so I think that you have got probably a 2 to 3 stop advantage of ISO advantage over the 5DSR. And so very, very impressed, Canon, with what you've done on that. Let's also look at dynamic range, where Canon claims some improvements. Let's see how shadow and highlight recovery have improved here. So we're going to take a look at dynamic range, and so first thing I just want to show you what our desired exposure looks like. And so this is base exposure, and so we're going to start by underexposing and then pulling back in post and see how we do. So starting off with one stop of underexposure, we can see that as we have pulled back, we have gotten really great texture information here in the grip, and our shadow information is nice and smooth, no problem. If we move on to 2 stops of shadow recovery, we can see that shadow information remains nice and smooth. We continue to have great contrast in the grip information. Everything actually looks really, really fantastic here. And if we zoom out, the images look similar. There's no real evidence that the original was underexposed. Likewise, at 3 stops on a global level, everything looks really nice and natural. Zooming in here, we can see that everything is nice and smooth. In our recovered information inside the SLR, there's no real new noise being introduced. And here in our shadow area, it continues to look nice and smooth. No problems there with shadow recovery. Finally, at 4 stops, we can see the faintest amount of some just pattern noise that is there in the shadow information. However, if we look up here on our subject, we have just the tiniest bit of pattern noise, probably not enough that you wouldn't even see outside of a pixel level. And our recovery on the grip surface, again, our contrast still looks great. Globally, the image looks fantastic. So to give some context, this is what the 4 stops of overexposure look like. And so as far as all the information we can see on the right in the grip of the SLR, none of that information is visible. And the right side of the camera completely fades out into the black there. And so, a really good job of shadow recovery. So by comparison, I've got the original EOS R here on the right side, and so you can see similar kind of shadow recovery. I do want to point out we've got just a little bit of a green cast that is here on this side. You can also see that globally the shadows don't look quite as smooth on the EOS R. And kind of the biggest area I wanted to point out is that while we've got a little bit of pattern noise here on the R5, what you can see on the original R is not only harsher pattern noising, even though we're at a lower resolution level, but a little bit of banding that is there as a part of that. You can also pick that up a bit on this side to where it's just not as smooth a recovery as what we see on the R5. Now, if we compare to the Sony a7R Mark III with a more similar kind of resolution, a couple of things that I do want to point out here. First of all, you can see that the Sony has not recovered as bright an image. And so you can see how nice the contrast remains on the R5. It looks a little bit flat and bland on the A7R Mark III by comparison. As far as the noise information, they're kind of similar, but what you can see is there's somewhat of a green cast that has come into some of that shadow information, whereas the R5 is more neutral. Looking down into this area, you know, the pattern noise, I think the R3 does a bit better than what the EOS R5 does, but I would say overall I like the R5 better because colors are staying more neutral and you're just recovering a little bit more brightness here as a byproduct. And so looking globally, you just have a, you know, kind of a brighter image with more pop to it coming out of the EOS R5. So if we go the opposite direction and we start to overexpose the image and then pull the exposure back in post, now we're looking at some different things as a part of that. We'll look at things like the yellow here in terms of retaining that color fidelity. Also seeing if we start to lose bits of information in and around text where hot spots develop and won't be able to come back, areas like this. And so we can see right now we're able to recover with a nice natural end result. Colors look similar, so one stop, no problem. So if we move on to 2 stops of overexposure and then pulling it back, we can see that we're continuing to get our yellows back without a problem. Looking at the timer face, everything looks very, very natural. This highlight hotspot here, we can see that we have lost the faintest amount of information. Likewise here, there are just a tiny bit of hotspots there where information has been lost. Outside of that, everything looks, you know, quite good and natural here. We're able to recover all of that without problem. It is moving on to that 3rd stop of overexposure where things start to fall apart here. So we can see the most obvious thing is we've lost the yellow, and it's an easy color to lose, which is why I like to use this veneer book as part of that surface. You can also see, however, that some of those same kind of tones we have lost out of the timer face, and so it's no longer there. The areas of contrast we have retained, but color is starting to be lost. And we can also see that some of that highlighted area here, hotspot, is becoming increasingly lost in terms of information. And so, you know, if you didn't have that primary yellow in there, you might be able to save this image and it might be usable. But if you've got certain colors that are easily lost, you will see some irreparable damage to 3 stops of overexposure. And if we move on to 4 stops of overexposure, obviously at this phase, this is not a redeemable image. It's lost any kind of natural look to it, and so the damage, I would say, is irreparable at that point. Now, again, just to show you perspective on how blown out that is, you can see here from this image. And so at least you've been able to pull that back, some of the information on the clock face, you know, on the back of the spines of the book. We've recovered a fair bit of information, but there are also areas where the damage is irreparable. This hot spot here, you're just not getting most of that information back. Now, if we compare the EOS R5 to the EOS R, a few things that are worth noting. You can see that there is a little bit more of an attempt to retain that kind of beige coloration on the R5. It's more completely lost here on this. We can also see this hotspot area. There's a little bit more of the information that has been retained, and so you know, the hotspot is a little bit smaller on the R5 versus the EOS R. This is at 3 stops of overexposure, by the way. And you can also see just a little bit more of the yellow color has been retained on the spine of the book. And so a marginally better performance, not an earth-shatteringly, you know, transformative highlight recovery comparison between the R5 and the EOS R. Now this is an area where I think that Sony still has an advantage, and so I do want to add a caveat in here, and that is that consistently in all of my tests, the the EOS R5 delivered a brighter image at equivalent settings. And so there's a little bit better ISO sensitivity on the EOS R5. And so in this case, I actually had to add more ambient light to get us up to equal exposure value. And so we could use similar settings. And I discovered it was around a half stop to 2/3 of a stop difference in sensor sensitivity, which is kind of a big deal. But all things being equalized, we can see that Sony is still better in recovering highlight information. And so this color here, I find that Sony is very good at retaining colors in highlight areas. And so if we look, for example, in this kind of hotspot pattern here, it's actually not radically better on the Sony than what it is on the EOS R5, but where the Sony wins is in terms of retaining color fidelity, and even here in the spine of the book you can see there's just a little bit more of that yellow that has been retained. And in the reds, I think that the reds are a little bit better defined. And so I do give Sony the win in highlight recovery, particularly when it comes to retaining colors and, and a slight edge for retaining information. And so obviously some significant improvements there when it comes to the dynamic range. And if you see this graph once again from photons to photos, you can see that they're showing the tracking to be very similar of dynamic range to that of the A7R Mark III, which is very, very impressive. And while I feel like Sony has an advantage in some areas, I could also see a few areas where Canon now has some advantage. So at the end of the day, I think that for most people in most situations, there's plenty of dynamic range to do what you're going to want to do with this camera. And of course, that's great. And if you're shooting video and shooting in log, you've got a lot of dynamic range to work with. And so that's also great there as well. I'm also enjoying the ability with a higher resolution body to where, you actually get some mileage out of that APS-C mode if you desire to do so. And 17 megapixel, it actually ends up being 1 megapixel less than the A7R Mark III, even though the A7R Mark III has only 42 versus 45. The reason for that is that Canon's crop factor for APS-C is 1.6 times versus 1.5 times for Sony. So you're getting a little bit of a deeper crop with Canon, which is the reason why you get a little bit lower resolution. At the same time, however, you can switch into APS-C mode, and if you really want to frame in tight, get a little bit of extra reach, without having to crop in post, it's really, really impressive. And the advantage, obviously, here versus the 5DSR or the 5DS is that you're now working with an electronic viewfinder, a fantastic electronic viewfinder. And so you're just seeing real time what that crop looks like. And so it's incredibly useful. And it's a feature that I'm going to enjoy for wildlife and, still having a usable amount of resolution, even if you're, cropping in fairly deeply. And as you can see from a few of these shots here, that is a huge amount of resolution. And so in 45 megapixels, you're able to deeply crop to take, basically photos from within photos with basically with impunity, particularly for the way that we share things on the internet. But even for prints, you have got a lot of flexibility with so many pixels to choose from. You just have a lot of flexibility on your framing options for macro work, for a variety of things. And so taking a face out of a group photo, for example, there's just a lot of very useful things you can do with that resolution. And of course, unlike Sony, we've got the ability here to shoot, MRAW or SRAW, and to shoot in RAW at lower resolution values. And so to me, that gives Canon the advantage when it comes to resolution right now, in that you have more flexibility in the way that you use that resolution. And so to me, the 45 megapixels of the EOS R5 are actually more valuable than those on the A7R Mark IV, even with that higher 61 megapixels of resolution, because I get a choice on how I'm going to use that resolution. And to me, that's really, really advantageous. And so again, kudos to Canon on that. Once again, we want to thank the sponsors of today's episode, Ridge Wallets. If you're tired of sitting on a bulky wallet full of stuff you don't need, then why not try a sleek, minimalist, modern wallet from Ridge? It holds up to 12 cards plus cash and employs RFID blocking technology to protect your information. There are 30 different styles, including aluminum, titanium, and carbon fiber options. Take a Ridge wallet for a 45-day test drive with a full refund guarantee if you don't like it.
Ridge has over 30,000 5-star reviews, and every wallet comes with a lifetime warranty. Visit ridge.com/Dustin and use code Dustin to get 10% off your order plus free shipping worldwide.
So at the end of the day, I think that this is probably the most versatile camera that Canon has ever put together. And this, I think the EOS R5 really shows the seriousness of intent that Canon has, that they are not just planning on entering into the full-frame mirrorless market. Their intent is to dominate that market. And whether or not they're able to do that still remains to be seen. I think that Sony is doing a great job in the mirrorless space. And I'm not as familiar with what Nikon is doing. It doesn't seem like they have as much momentum, but what is obvious here is that Canon is playing for keeps here. And the EOS R5, if it's within your budget, it just basically does almost everything well. And that's not something you can say of a lot of cameras. So at the end of the day, I'm very, very impressed with the EOS R5. One of these EOS R5s is going to stay with me. I have purchased one of them, and it will become my main Canon camera that I will build my lenses and my reviews around moving ahead. And so a great job, Canon. It's not a flawless camera, but wow, you delivered on a pretty impressive spec list and did it in a very impressive fashion. And so at the end of the day, call me impressed. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the description down below, you can find a linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery, lots of photos there. There are buying links, including to my newest affiliate partner, which is Camera Canada, and they're the ones that stepped up in the midst of my crises of not being able to get an EOS R5. They said, we can get you one. They gave me a good price on one. So if you're in Canada, don't hesitate to give them business. They are really, really great people, and I'm happy to have them on board. And I also want to thank B&H Photo. There were some mix-ups, but they got me one in the end, and so I appreciate having the loaner copy as well to help with this evaluation. And so check out the buying links there below, and beyond that, linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.